What I want to do today is discuss a physicist, Sean Carroll, why he thinks the God hypothesis is a bad one. All you atheists persist in arguing scientifically. Sean Carroll is using science to refute the God concept as a good concept. What he says is the best way to talk about whether there's a God is to think about what the world would look like if there was a God as a blank slate. Think about what the world should look like if there was a God, and that matches up to the world we have now, then that's an argument for God. And if it doesn't match up, then something's wrong. You can see where he's going. He does say the problem of evil causes this dilemma. It creates a world that if we go back and we erase everything, we say, what would the world look like if a God came along and invented a world? And we would start to describe things and they wouldn't be as evil as they are. He says, okay, that's not really scientific. It's a big problem for religious people, but he's giving them that. We see science as saying the world is random and indifferent, and that's not going to work for religious people. Sean Carroll says, if you look at the world physically, what would you expect if you start with a blank slate? You don't know any of your preconceived notions, what you have learned about the world all the years you've been alive. Get rid of all that. Here's God. He's going to create a world. What are the possibilities for what that world would look like? And so his argument is, when you look at the Big Bang, which is what we're really talking about in terms of cosmology, when we're looking at the beginning, the scientists say Big Bang. The point is that the world started with low entropy. And for him, this low entropy was so remarkable. Low entropy means it was organized, which means it was simple, which means the way gases and what started as our world was extremely uniform. And it required that low entropy because if you have a disorganized high entropy environment, it's much harder to then create from that. So the world started, according to science, as extremely low entropy, which means extremely organized. So if God was in charge of this process, Sean Carroll says, whether you agree or not, you would not have needed to have excess low entropy, extremely uniform system that allowed for billions of universes. You would only have needed one. You would only have needed what you could have had is a balanced entropy, right? I guess he's saying there's effort here. The effort into creating this extremely, extremely low 10 to the 120 billion low entropy, this extreme organization. I guess the argument made it was easy for God to do. I don't know. His point is it never would have been necessary. And what's interesting is in some ways, this argument, even though it's for a different thing, reflects Thomas Reid's geometry of the visibles. So his point is that low entropy is over-organized and really basic in order to create a complex world. And it created an extremely complex world that we don't need. We don't need these universes. We don't need all these systems that don't help. We could have easily started with a balanced, I guess he's saying it would have been easier to do that and not put all this energy into the uniformity. And because of that, we can then speculate as a scientist that, first of all, we don't know how it started. That's the point. But if it was to be a God, he accepts the God definition. You can see where my problem is. He accepts the God definition and says that God wouldn't have needed this effort. He wouldn't have needed it at all. The world we do see doesn't match up with the idea of what the world would be if we looked at God and then said, what would you create given a blank slate? So to sum this up, I think what he's saying is simply, why do we need all these stars? When you look at the sky and you see the stars and everything going on and everything that's been created over these billions of years, we wouldn't have needed that for this small little planet and human life and all of these concerns that are ours that the God definition seems to prioritize. So we're saying, why do we need all that stuff? So this low entropy at the beginning is what was necessary to create all this stuff. But if God was the one that created it, we wouldn't have needed all this stuff. So I think that's the summation. But I do want to touch on one other thing that Carroll said. He says, if you imagine a God and you erase everything you know about the universe, everything you know about life, and you just say, here's a God, what would it look like if he created a world? And then you try in a fresh, blank slate way, come up with that idea. And he says the first three problems and less modern problems are problem of evil, problem of suffering, and problem of explanation. And so I guess what he's saying was, if I had a blank slate, what would the world look like that God created? It wouldn't be this evil. Problem of suffering is it wouldn't have this much suffering. And the problem of explanations is interesting also. And it means if he did create this world and he did write a guidebook, why isn't that guidebook more simple to understand? He says, hey, I write textbooks. People complain about them not being clear. You would think God writing a textbook, writing a guidebook would make it super, super clear, but yet it's super ambiguous. And so I guess that's his scientific perspective on it, but you can see what he's saying. So I hope that rounds it out for you. Thanks for watching.